Today, we're jumping into a really charged topic in America. Faith, citizenship, and, their place in public life.
Yeah, it's huge.
We've waded through a bunch of sources, history, legal stuff, even current polls, to kind of give you the rundown on that whole complex separation of church and state idea.
And what we found is the sources really zero in on three fundamental questions, big questions for anyone of faith.
Okay.
So first, should people of faith really get involved in earthly citizenship, or is that just pulling focus from what really matters?
Right, that classic tension.
Second, should pastors, religious leaders actually talk about the tough stuff, the cultural, political issues from the pulpit today?
Especially now.
And the last one, maybe the biggest, is America itself, the society, the values, the whole political and economic setup, is it actually worth saving?
That's the core, isn't it?
Yeah.
So stick with us. You'll find out where that separation phrase really came from. Spoiler, not the Constitution.
And why John Adams apparently gave preachers the credit for the Declaration of Independence.
Plus, what polling shows Americans actually want to hear about these days? Okay, let's dive in. So let's hit that big one first. Is America worth saving? One source had a really blunt way of looking at it.
Yeah, kind of litmus test.
Basically, they argue, look at whether people are fighting to get in or fighting to get out. That tells you a lot about whether a country's working.
And when you look at the numbers, particularly immigration data, the argument for American exceptionalism gets pretty strong. We looked at a UN survey.
Yeah.
The U.S. holds 20%, 1/5 of all international immigrants on the entire planet.
1 in 5. Worldwide.
Yep. And get this. The sources point out that's more immigrants than the second, third, fourth, and fifth most popular countries put together.
Wow. Combined.
Yeah.
That's a powerful statistic.
It really is. It kind of paints a picture, doesn't it? People vote with their feet. You hear about the American dream, not so much the, North Korean or Venezuelan dream.
Fair point. And the sources pin this appeal down to a couple of key things. First, stability. The U.S. Constitution. It's the oldest continuous one in the world. That creates a bedrock, a political security you don't find everywhere.
And then there's the prosperity piece.
Yeah, only 4% of the world's population, but holding, 25% of the wealth?
That's the stat. And the source links that to a system that, rewards hard work. Personal exceptionalism. You put in the effort, you get the results.
And it's funny, that term exceptional, it wasn't even coined by an American.
Right. It was that French guy, de Tocqueville, way back in the 1830s. He saw something unique even then.
So, okay, if we accept the premise the system draws people in, it has these foundations, that leads right into your second question.
Exactly. Who did the founders, or at least the sources we read, say actually built the intellectual foundation for all that?
And this is where it gets really interesting, historically speaking. The sources claim, if you ask someone like John Adams, who really drove the ideas behind American liberty?
He wouldn't point to politicians first?
Nope. He'd point straight to the pastors. Figures like Reverend Samuel Cooper, Jonathan Mayhew, George Whitefield.
So the claim is that the core ideas in the Declaration, self-evident truths, God-given rights, weren't new in 1776.
Not at all. The argument is they were standard sermon material in American pulpits for decades before the revolution really kicked off.
That reframes things.
There's a great story in the source material about Reverend Jonas Clark in Lexington.
Lexington, like a Battle of Lexington.
The very same. The source argues Clark fired the first shot, conceptually, with his sermons, teaching liberty, the role of government, all from a biblical perspective. And the men on Lexington Green, they were his congregation.
Wow. So the influence wasn't just abstract philosophy.
Not according to these sources. They say pastors back then tackled everything.
Like what?
Well, election sermons laying out biblical criteria, like from Exodus 18, for picking leaders. They talked about judges, even what we'd call Supreme Court nominations. Social issues, think Sodom and Gomorrah. Even the rules for a just war.
So nothing was off limits?
That's the core belief highlighted. There isn't a single subject the Bible doesn't touch on, or that's out of bounds for a biblical worldview.
Which makes the whole modern idea of keeping faith and politics totally separate.
Feel pretty foreign to how things apparently started, yeah. Okay, so this is where the historical record, as presented in our sources, really clashes with, what most of us think we know.
Right. The sources take a really strong stance here. They basically call the common understanding of separation of church and state a huge misunderstanding, maybe even a deliberate distortion.
A lie is the word used in one source. Strong language.
Very strong. And the first point they hammer home is that phrase, separation of church and state. It's nowhere in the Constitution.
Right. That's key. It comes from a letter, doesn't it?
Exactly. Thomas Jefferson, 1802, writing to the Danbury Baptist Association, and the context, they argue, is everything.
What was the context?
Jefferson was reassuring Baptists who were worried about the government establishing a national religion, like in England. He used the wall of separation metaphor to say the government wouldn't interfere with them.
Ah, so a one-way wall, protecting the church from the government?
That's the argument, protecting the church, guaranteeing its freedom from state control. But crucially, the sources insist it was never meant to stop the church from influencing society or the state.
Okay, so if that was the original intent, how did it get flipped to mean keeping religion out of public life?
The sources point a finger directly at a 1947 Supreme Court case, Everson v. Board of Education.
And what happened there?
This is the really provocative claim. The source argues that Justice Hugo Black, writing for the court, took just 8 words out of Jefferson's letter.
Just 8 words.
Pulled them out of context, they say, and basically redefined the phrase. Twisted it from protecting the church from the state into restricting religious expression in the public square.
That's a huge accusation that it was intentional twisting, not just legal interpretation. What's the evidence they offer for that?
They point to the immediate impact. How that phrase suddenly started getting used in court cases instead of the actual First Amendment text about establishment and free exercise.
So the 8 words replace the Constitution, effectively.
In practice, in many cases, yes. They also point to Jefferson's own actions, like attending church services held inside the Capitol building while he was president. Actions that seem totally at odds with the strict separation idea.
And the impact since 47.
Massive. The sources say that phrase has been cited over 3,000 times in federal court cases since then. It became the go-to legal standard, even if based on a shaky foundation.
And there was something else that added to this, the Johnson Amendment.
Yeah, 1954, Lyndon Johnson apparently slipped it into a bill. It wasn't directly about this, but it created this widespread fear among churches and nonprofits.
Fear of what?
That if they spoke out on political issues or endorsed candidates, they'd lose their tax-exempt status. The source calls it a paper tiger. Legally, maybe not that strong, but the perception created a huge chilling effect. Pastors just clammed up.
So this legal shift, this pullback of faith from the public square, the sources connect this directly to broader problems.
Absolutely. They draw a line from those legal changes to what they see as a growing cultural confusion, especially around truth itself.
Where did that start?
You can track it through decisions about public schools in the 50s. First, Engle v. Vitale in 62 that took out voluntary prayer.
Okay.
Then Abington v. Shemp in 63 that removed Bible reading.
Right, I remember those.
But the source we read saves its sharpest critique for a 1980 case, Stone v. Graham.
What did that one do?
That's the one that removed the 10 Commandments from school walls.
Why? What was the reasoning?
It's pretty stunning when you read it. The court's fear, explicitly stated, was that kids might read them, study them, and obey them.
Wait, obey the 10 Commandments. That was seen as a violation.
A violation of the Establishment Clause, according to the court then. So think about that sequence. In less than 20 years, you remove public prayer, Bible reading, and the 10 Commandments from schools. 3 major reference points for morality gone.
And the sources argue this created a vacuum.
A vacuum that led directly to confusion about basic reality. They cite these interviews done at the University of Washington.
What happened there?
Students were presented with hypothetical situations like a 5'9" white man claiming to be a 6'5", 7-year-old Chinese woman.
Okay, strange hypothetical.
And the students were apparently unable or unwilling to just say, no, that's subjectively not true. They couldn't draw clear lines. The source literally describes it as brain frying, the result of removing fixed truths and saying, well, anything goes.
Wow. That inability to define reality.
Yeah.
How does that connect to conscience?
It connects directly to liberty of conscience. The source uses this analogy. Imagine forcing Lionel Richie, a black artist, to perform at a Ku Klux Klan rally.
Okay, obviously wrong. You can't compel someone to use their talent for something they find morally repugnant.
Exactly. No one would argue the government has that right. So the source asks, why is it different when the government tries to force, say, a baker or a photographer or a florist to use their artistic gifts for an event like a wedding ceremony that violates their core religious beliefs?
It's the same principle of compelled speech or action against conscience.
That's the argument, and it circles back to the founders. Jefferson himself asked, can the liberties of a nation be thought secure if we remove their only firm basis? What was that basis? a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God.
Removing that conviction, he feared, undermines liberty itself.
Which brings us right back around to those first two questions we started with.
Right. In this environment, this confusion, should Christians engage? And what's the role of the pulpit now?
Well, there's often this idea, maybe among some church leaders, that wading into politics or controversial issues will just push people away, alienate the congregation.
Yeah, you hear that concern a lot.
But the Barna survey data in our sources, it paints a totally different picture.
How so?
Barna asked people about 150 different issues, and overwhelmingly, people said they want to hear a biblical perspective on the tough stuff.
They want it, even the controversial topics.
Especially those. Look at the numbers. 91% want to hear about abortion from a biblical view. 86% want to hear about religious liberty. 82% about sexual identity issues.
91%, that's
Yeah.
almost everyone.
Exactly. So the reluctance to talk about these things, the sources argue it's not coming from the people sitting in the pews. They want the guidance.
But are they getting it? Is the guidance there?
That's the flip side. While the desire is high, the sources point to a real crisis in biblical literacy. Basically, people aren't equipped.
What do the stats show?
Only about 14% of Christians read the Bible daily. And even more stark, only 10% of self-identified Christians actually have what Barna defines as a biblical worldview.
Only 10%.
And it drops to just 4% for millennials. So people might wear the label Christian, but they often lack the actual framework, the biblical thinking, to apply their faith to citizenship, to culture, to these tough questions.
So a huge gap between people wanting guidance and the church maybe not providing it effectively.
That's the implication. And the source wraps this up with a really pointed quote from Charles Finney, the revivalist.
What did Finney say?
He said, basically, if immorality prevails in the land, the fault is ours, meaning the church, in great degree. If there is a decay of conscience, the pulpit is responsible for it. Pretty direct.
Wow. Taking responsibility.
Yeah, and connecting it all together, looking at quotes from figures like Andrew Jackson, Benjamin Rush. The message is consistent.
Which is?
That the Bible, its principles, are like the instruction manual for a free republic. If you ignore that moral foundation, society starts to fray, chaos increases.
And then the government has to step in more and more to control things?
Exactly. Leading, ironically, to less liberty. George Mason warned about it. Liberty requires a frequent recurrence to fundamental principles. You have to keep going back to the foundations. Hashtag tag outro.
Okay, so let's recap. We hit those three questions. Is America worth saving? The data suggests yes, based on who wants in, should the pulpit engage. History says it was foundational. And that separation phrase, way more complicated and maybe misused than most people think.
Definitely a different picture than the standard narrative.
For me, the real surprises were that Barna data people do want to talk about this stuff. And the specific claim about the Everson case, how those 8 words from Jefferson's letter allegedly got twisted.
Yeah, the intentionality claim is pretty stark.
So what's the takeaway for you listening right now?
Well, the sources we looked at argue pretty forcefully that history, the founding ideals, even current public opinion, they all point towards faith having a vital role in the public square, not isolated from it.
And that the current cultural confusion isn't random.
No, they link it directly to, essentially, a failure of discipleship, a failure to provide that grounding biblical worldview in the wider culture.
Reminds me of that quote Mike Huckabee said, "History is to the culture what memory is to an individual."
That's good. Connects the past to the present.
So if the sources are right that we're facing a kind of cultural amnesia, we've forgotten how we got here and how freedom is maintained, here's a final thought for you.
What specific piece of history, maybe a figure or a principle we didn't even touch on today, do you need to revisit this week? What part of our cultural memory do you need to personally restore?
Something to think about.